Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to The Meiji Guillotine Murders by Fūtarō Yamada, translated by Bryan Karetnyk. The Chief Inspectorate of the Imperial Prosecuting Office, Chapter 4. At Kodenma-cho, there was a single block, right in the middle of the neighborhood. It was enclosed by a long, blackened mud brick wall, some 8 feet high and topped with bamboo spikes. Nailed to the wall beside the entrance was a still new sign bearing the words Tokyo Prison, which is to say this was the notorious Kodenma-cho jail. "Hello," said Heikurō Imokawa, addressing the 2 sentries stationed at the entrance. "I don't suppose Sergeant Ichinohata's around, is he?" Though the world might have changed drastically, the new government seemed, for the time being, loath to touch the prison's facilities or its setup, and the old jailers had been allowed to remain in their posts. Naturally, however, quite a few of them had panicked and run off, and so the situation was that a number of razotsu had been hired to fill their jobs. The sentries were also friends of theirs. "He is! Come in!" With these words from the sentries, the group piled in. The prison was not a nice place to visit. Just setting foot inside was enough to send shivers down your spine. Sohachi Ichinohata, who worked there, had once offered to give them a tour, but all of them had politely declined, and usually, after a brief chat in a place called Jailer's Row, which was used these days for meetings between visitors and prison officials, they would beat a hasty retreat. It was this room that they were now heading for. As they got closer, they could hear a loud voice coming from further inside the building. "Give it back! Give me back the money!" With a suspicion written across their faces, the 4 entered. In a corner, Ichinohata was standing there, crestfallen, his head slumped on his chest. In front of him, a man was reprimanding him, his arm outstretched and almost prodding Ichinohata on the nose. "To say nothing of the fact that you're just a guard here!" He turned to look at the 4 razotsu who had just entered, but showed no sign of fear. "In any case, how is it that an official of His Imperial Majesty's government could defraud the people?" The 4 of them all turned to one another with looks of embarrassment. Just who could this man be? He must be an outsider, of course, but he was an imposing, fine figure of a man, somewhere in his mid-30s. He wore a commoner's topknot and had a striped kimono that he had tucked up into his waistband, revealing a pair of purple undertrousers. He had a large mouth and a strong jaw, as well as a very lean, sinewy physique. But he didn't look at all like a samurai. For one thing, he didn't even carry a sword. And yet despite this, Ichinohata, who was by nature a timid sort, though still a razotsu, was visibly trembling in the corner. It was Onimaru who spoke first. "And just who the hell are you to be raising your voice in a place like this?" "I, sir? My name is Yukichi Fukuzawa." The 4 of them turned pale. This was no ordinary commoner. Even they knew that this was the name of the renowned Western scholar who had opened a great place of learning called the Keiōin Shiba Shinsenza. And just what do you mean by give me back the money? Well, I have some business, you see, with a certain prisoner here. Ever since the summer, I've been coming to this jail, bringing him books, clothes, money, and what have you. Or at least that was my intention. I simply assumed that the prisoner was here. When I first came to make a few inquiries, it was this man who told me that he was, and ever since he's acted as the intermediary for these provisions, said Fukuzawa, his face still puce with rage. Puce, a dark red puce. His face still puce with rage. But as it so happens, it was all a sham. Yesterday, I learned that the man in question is not being held at Koden Macho at all. This man has cheated me. How dare he tell such a barefaced lie? So I've come for an explanation and to demand the return of all the goods and money I've handed over. Are my anger and my demand unjustified? He was no longer shouting, but his voice, let alone the meaning of his words, had a force that is difficult to convey. It was little wonder that Ichinohata was so afraid. They are unjustified, Saruki piped up in a high-pitched voice. In what way are they unjustified? It is, by and large, considered improper to bring inmates goods and money. It's only natural that they should be confiscated. If it's improper, then why were they not returned to me in the first place? Aha! Got you there, haven't I? Well, in that case, I'm not the only one guilty of wrongdoing, am I? I won't stand for this, said Onimaru, slapping his red scabbard. You need cutting down to size, you do. Cut me down. Don't make me laugh. Unbeknownst to the Razotsu, in May of the previous year at Keio University, when the rumble of cannon at the Battle of Ueno reverberated like distant thunder, this man had simply carried on with his lecture on Francis Wayland's Treatise on Economics. Now, as then, he did not so much as flinch, and instead merely spat out, I was relieved when the overbearing and corrupt officials of the shogunate disappeared, but it appears that no matter how much the world may change, officials will still be officials. But then, I don't quite know whether these new-fangled Razotsu even count as officials, apropos of which, let me tell you something. The Razotsu may be policemen in name, but if you ask me, they're nothing more than roving gangsters. I really shouldn't say this, but just the other day I went to brief Lord Iwakura on the West's system of law enforcement, but I didn't manage to convince him. If a Razotsu were to cut me down with his idiot meter, then we might see reform a damn sight sooner. What's that? Lord Iwakura? Idiot meter? The Razotsu were dumbfounded. He means your sword. He thinks its length is a measure of your idiocy. With a hearty laugh, Fukuzawa suddenly turned towards the open door. There, just outside it, with the setting sun behind his back, stood somebody new. There was a note of madness in his voice, and he cut a very odd figure. The Razotsu, with the exception of Ichinohata, all stared in astonishment. None, not one of them, Fukuzawa included, could put a name to the attire worn by the man, but he had on a pale blue suikan robe, a pair of hakama with legs that were tied at the ankles in traditional kegutsu furred boots. Can we help you? Came a suspicious voice from the crowd of Razotsu. And who might you be? Fukuzawa finally asked. Chief Inspector Keishiro Kazuki of the Imperial Prosecuting Office, at your service. Looking the man over again as he entered, they now saw that he had jet black hair, worn knotted at the back, and he even had eyebrows drawn on his forehead, as noblemen did in bygone times. Hanging at his waist was a sword that looked like an old-fashioned samurai's tachi rather than a katana. And in his hand he carried a folded fan made of cypress wood. Though still a young man in his mid-20s, this most elegant and handsome figure looked like a courtier who had stepped out of the Heian period. The Imperial Prosecuting Office, I see, said Fukuzawa, flabbergasted, mumbling as he thought for a moment. The name of the body is familiar to me, although I'm astonished that our new government has seen fit to bring out of retirement such an ancient and venerable institution from the annals of our country's history, even if I do agree with the spirit of it. Simply put, it's an office to catch malfeasance carried out by government officials. Isn't that it? Well, if so, then I have something important to tell you. I am Yukichi Fukuzawa, rector of Keio University. He introduced himself and once again launched into his tale. There's a soldier of the old shogunate by the name of Takeaki Enomoto who, after surrendering in the Battle of Hakodate in the 5th month of this year, was sent to Tokyo. Now, I'm a native of Nakatsu in Kyushu and have no connection whatsoever to this Enomoto. But in the summer, quite by chance, I heard that his family, having no inkling what happened to him afterwards, was extremely worried about him. As I say, I myself don't even have a passing acquaintance with Enomoto, but I was impressed by the fact that he had fought for the shogun right to the bitter end. They lost, I believe, only because they lacked numbers, so I decided to go out of my way to help. Well, I said to myself, since the man would be deemed a criminal, why not go to jail in Kodenmacho and find out? So when I came here, whom did I happen to meet but that scrawny weed over there? He was the one who had the audacity to tell me that Enomoto was here and that he was looking after him. So, ever since, I've been duly coming to drop off books and money and so forth for him. But would you believe, Enomoto has never in fact been here? Yesterday, I learned that he's being held in the military prison in Tatsunokuchi. That's why I'm so irate and have come to protest. I don't regret the money or the goods in the slightest. However, I cannot forgive such a wicked and humiliating lie, Razotsu or not. In fact, it's precisely because he's a Razotsu that this cannot be overlooked. Tell me, kind sir, is my objection unreasonable? It's perfectly reasonable, the young chief inspector replied. His voice sounded clear, sweet even. He then turned his narrowed eyes towards Ichinohata. Return it. But I can't, said Ichinohata, flustered. You mean to say it's all been disposed of? Asked Kazuki. A wry smile creased one of his cheeks. At any rate, this matter will be duly investigated, and it is the government's responsibility to compensate you for any goods or money that have been misappropriated. Sergeant, if you commit a crime like this ever again, you can be sure that you'll be punished. Kazuki looked not just at Ichinohata, but at all four of the others. Is that understood? You will be punished by the authority of the Imperial Prosecuting Office, he repeated. Dismissed! The 5 Razotsu left the meeting room in a daze. In fact, each of them looked as though he had had a narrow escape. Please forgive me, said Kazuki, bowing to the rector, who wore a look of considerable dissatisfaction. It's still early days for the new government, and there are all kinds of disreputable sorts swarming around. It's hard to catch all of them. The Imperial Prosecuting Office has begun conducting citywide patrols only recently. Do all the officials of the Imperial Prosecuting Office dress like you? Fukuzawa inquired, voicing a question that had been nagging at him. No, I'm afraid it's just me, Kazuki replied with a laugh. If I may say so, you look as though you have something on your mind. I heard about the establishment of the Imperial Prosecuting Office, said Fukuzawa. But to be honest, I hadn't much of an idea what it did. Later, I found out that it was a revival of the Heian period administration set up to investigate and root out official corruption. Rumor has it that there are some very old-fashioned people in its ranks. At any rate, as far as I can see, it isn't just the likes of the Razotsu that are up to no good. Higher up, there seem to be plenty more disgraceful types trying to line their pockets amid the chaos of the changing times. With all due respect, how much does the Imperial Prosecuting Office know about this, and what measures is it taking to deal with it? Looking straight into the eyes of Fukuzawa, who had put the question so bluntly, Kazuki replied. What measures indeed? As you're doubtless aware, sir, right now in Tokyo, the former residents of various daimyo are lying unoccupied. There are several gangs who, amid all the confusion, would very much like to get their grubby hands on them. We're conducting secret investigations into such cases. Ah, yes, of course. You mentioned your recent visit to Lord Iwakura to teach him about the Western system of policing. I'm also aware that a mansion in Mita, which belonged to the daimyo of the Shimabara domain, with a building of some 769 tsubo and grounds of more than 14,000 tsubo, came under discussion. You apparently asked whether it could be sold to you for the low price of 1 ryo per tsubo as compensation for your advice. Startled, Yukichi Fukuzawa drew a sharp breath, while Keishiro Kazuki merely grinned, revealing a beautiful set of teeth. Sir, how do you think the Imperial Prosecuting Office should go about treating such cases? Chapter 5. That evening, at an izakaya in a back street of Nihonbashi Bakuro-cho, 4 of the Razotsu were drinking. Having been detained by work at the prison, Ichinohata was running late. By the time he eventually arrived, the others were getting ready to leave. When asked whether he had been questioned any more about the events earlier, he told them that he hadn't. Hearing this, Jirōmasa Saruki immediately asked, Hey, so Hachi, so what's the score with that devil from the Imperial what's-its-name? I don't know, replied Ichinohata, cocking his head. He started coming to the prison about 10 days ago. Could he be investigating one of the inmates? No, but he's up to something strange. Strange? Yes, at the back of the prison, there's a spot for beheading criminals. He's had a new hut built there and a large dais erected in the yard. Then, 2 or 3 days ago, a wooden box twice as tall as a man was brought in from Yokohama. Well, strictly speaking, it came from France, but it seems to have been ordered by the chief inspector. What? From France? What could it be, I wonder? I've no idea what's inside it, said Ichinohata, shaking his head feebly. But never mind that. I'm still in trouble after they found out about those packages. But didn't you just say that there wasn't going to be any investigation? True, but I can't make any money through that wheeze anymore. And I've still got plenty of mouths that need feeding, and palms that need greasing. Leaning over his cup of sake, Ichinohata held his head in his hands. Besides, that chief inspector may look like a soft touch, but still, there's something uncanny about him. He did say that you could be sure of punishment if you ever did it again, said Onimaru, sticking out a generous lower lip from beneath his beard. The little upstart had the cheek to take that high and mighty tone. Hey, innkeeper, more sake. Do you think the Imperial Prosecuting Office will really be keeping an eye on us? Asked Heikurō Imokawa, beset by anxiety once again. Even if they wanted to, they'd never catch up with us. Not if they had thousands of men working for them, said Heisuke Yokomaru with a chuckle. They were truly an incorrigible lot. They wore their authority as a mantle and made it their daily task to cheat people out of their money with all manner of empty threats, extorting and swindling wherever they went. Their hapless victims just assumed that everyone in a position of authority did likewise. That was far from the case, however. That upstart must be from Satsuma or Chōshū, or one of the domains that overthrew the shogunate. Don't you think? And just what kind of chief inspector goes around in that get-up? Whatever he may say, there's something crooked about him. After all, only 2 or 3 years ago, all these so-called government officials were wanted by the police. Half of them were arsonists, bandits, and murderers. And now they preach to us about society and the nation and what have you. Whereas in actual fact, day after day, night after night, they're buying up every last place in Yanagibashi and having a grand old time of it. They're the same people who drummed up unrest and went marching through the streets chanting, "Expel the barbarians!" They're the same people who overthrew the shogun and then when all was said and done, played the dumb, as if to say, who were all those people chanting? They've simply vanished! They began to gabble excitedly over one another, and it was not just the alcohol talking. They were filled with genuine indignation over the state of the country. They aren't just playing dumb. They've been allowed to give full vent to their greed and lust with absolute impunity. Ichinohata, next time you meet that devil, tell him that if he means to go after anyone, it's the top officials he should be looking at. The government ministers and councillors of state, why, they aren't much older than we are. In fact, some of them are even younger. And they're all raking it in, while we have to go to these unspeakable lengths just to scrape together enough money to buy some cheap whore for the pleasure quarter. It's a world gone mad, damn it! Innkeeper, we're out of sake. And hey, give us all that octopus you've got there. The innkeeper wore a pained expression. He had no other customers, for they had all skulked off the moment they saw the Razotsu traipsing in. The 5 of them were all former members of a security unit that was set up at the end of the Edo period. the so-called Shinchōgumi. In the early 1860s, the shogunate had scrapped together the masterless samurai known as Ronin to keep order in the city of Edo. But in their final days, far from keeping order, they had turned into a plague, blackmailing and extorting money from the citizens. Thinking back on it now, though, while their conduct used to be more brazen, they had nevertheless had high hopes for the future. Nowadays, they all lived in the tenement houses near the slums. The heroic-looking Tamonta Onimaru, still unmarried, lived with his 63-year-old mother and 88-year-old grandmother. Jirōmasa Saruki, who fell into a trance whenever he was counting money, had a wife who ate so prodigiously that she looked like a sumo wrestler. Heisuke Yokomakura, whose philosophy was that the best way is always to do nothing at all, had unaccountably 7 children. Heikurō Imokawa who used flattery to cage money from his colleagues, might have had no wife, but he did have 5 younger siblings to look after. And the sickly-looking weed Sohachi Ichinohata had a hot-tempered spouse, who at least once a day would strike her husband's sunken cheeks and send his head spinning. As chance would have it, only the previous day they had all got it in the neck from their mothers, come to blows with their wives, or been reduced to tears by their siblings and children. And so, to distract themselves, they had all thought of buying a woman. Oddly enough, a love of prostitutes was the only thing they shared. For some reason, they had ended up placing their faith in Ichinohata, who seemed to be in the money, to make this happen. But when they visited him at the prison, they had been frightened by that odd-looking devil from the Heian period court, which dampened their ardor. And that was how they had wound up drinking in a backstreet izakaya instead. Ardor, sexual excitement, ardor, which dampened their ardor. And that was how they had wound up drinking in a backstreet izakaya instead. If things get any worse, we can kiss goodbye to surrounding ourselves with beautiful Maiko from Yanagibashi and discussing the great affairs of state, drawled Onimaru. Maybe I'll never hold a beautiful woman in my arms again. My hopes, my dreams, all gone. With that, he hung his bearded head over his plate of octopus and began to weep. He was awfully prone to weeping after a drink or two. Can we really be done for? Unlike you lot, I still have so many things that I want to do. No, not just the women. There are things that I ought to have done as a man. Unlike you lot? That's a bit harsh, isn't it? Said the lazy Yokomakura, pouting. I have things that I want to do too. You? Such as? Well, I don't really know. But still, I just have this feeling that there are things I want to do. I wish that I could be a man, cried Onimaru, tears welling in his eyes. I don't know how, but I'd like to die having done something that would make people think I'd lived a meaningful life. Hear, hear, shouted Imokawa. Then after a pause, he got to his feet. This bar isn't exactly lifting my spirits. Why don't we all pile down to Yoshiwara anyway? Seeing the group clatter towards the exit in a flurry of excitement, the innkeeper quickly called after them. Gentlemen, your bill! I'll settle up with you next time I'm on patrol in the area, said Saruki. You can wait until then. I'm sorry, but that just won't do. We run a hand-to-mouth sort of establishment. Having been bawling his eyes out only a moment before, Onimaru now looked over his shoulder and yelled at the owner. Don't be absurd! Just who do you think it is who makes it possible for you to run a hand-to-mouth sort of establishment? In such a treacherous world, aren't we the ones who go without sleep just to keep the likes of you in business? Chapter 6. Having left the izakaya behind, the 5 Rozotsu set off in the direction of Asakusa, their arms around each other's shoulders. The group marched in a line down the lawless, moonlit, already deserted streets, singing a popular ditty of the day at the top of their voices. Up ahead of them, the shadow of the palace gate at Asakusa drew into view. But just then, somebody came running out of a side alley. Who's there? The figure called out, having heard the singing and stopping it dead. He peered at the group through the moonlight. Oh, sergeants! There's robbers! I'm being robbed! Help me, please! He practically ran into them, falling to the ground and clutching at their ankles. There's 3 of them, he said in a shrill voice. They had their swords drawn and were threatening me. One false move and they would have killed me. Oh, how glad I am! How happy I am to see you, Sergeant! Quickly! Now, it's the Shimuya pawn shop just over there! Imokawa shook off his hands. Terribly sorry, but right now we're on urgent official business. There's a police station just up there by the palace gate at Asakusa. Go there if you want. The 5 of them spun around. They had all sobered up the moment they stopped singing, and so now they marched off with a true sense of urgency. At the crossroads directly in front of them, however, were 2 silhouettes coming towards them and barring their way. Who could they be? Before they could ask the question, the Razotsu were startled. In the moonlight, they recognized the silhouette of a Suikan and also the outline of a Fuka Amigasa. Go back! Said the figure in the Suikan. Is there a law that permits Razotsu to run away? The man in the Fuka Amigasa added, even after being informed that there are bandits around? The second man spoke with a Satsuma accent. Turn back, he commanded. The 5 Razotsu were stunned. They spun around and retraced their steps in confusion. Which one of you was it who told him to go away? The man in the Fuka Amigasa asked. It was me, replied Imokawa, trembling. The man who had approached them earlier was nowhere to be seen. He must have run off to the police station in Asakusa, leaving the figure in the Suikan and the Razotsu where they were. The man in the Fuka Amigasa marched off into the alleyway by himself. Moments later, he returned and said, All right, it's the pawn shop 5 or 6 doors down. The only way out is through this alley. Kazuki, would you flush them out? I'll wait here and shoot them when they come running. From the breast of his kimono, he extracted something that astonished the Razotsu, a pistol. No, wait! We don't want to kill them, said the man in the Suikan with a shake of his head. I need them alive. Better you shoot the pistol here. The bandits will come flying out and down the alley. That's where I'll catch them. Are you sure that's best? I think so. When they saw the object that he drew from his waist, the Razotsu were wide-eyed in amazement. It was not a sword, but a folded cypress wood fan that they had seen earlier that afternoon. Then, his furried boots muffling his footsteps, he entered the alley. Rather than ask how on earth he was going to arrest the bandits with only a fan, the Razotsu, and especially Imokawa, could not resist asking a question that had been plaguing them from the outset. "Sir," they called out to the samurai wearing the fuka amigasa, "who on earth are you?" "I'm Chief Inspector Toshiyoshi Kawaji," the man replied, "of the Imperial Prosecuting Office." He raised the arm in which he was holding the pistol. Down in the alley, the cypress wood fan opened with a flourish. Excellent! The blast of the gun rent the moonlit sky. Bang! A moment later, a tangle of figures appeared in the alleyway. They peered out of the darkness into the street, then gave a cry of alarm and hastily beat a retreat before stopping dead in their tracks. The Razotsu saw the flash of several swords being drawn. Shing, shing! A flurry of movement, then all was still. "Over here!" called the figure in the sukan, stepping out of the shadows. Seeing him stand there on his own, the Razotsu were taken aback. Drawn by the sound of gunfire, locals began appearing from all over, curious to find out what the commotion was. When they saw the fantastic vision of a heian courtier seemingly floating before them in a moonlight-drenched Tokyo alleyway, they stopped, spellbound. "There's no cause for alarm," said the figure in the suikan, slowly undulating his cypress wood fan. Suikan, a type of traditional Japanese overrobe worn by male court officials in the Heian period. Suikan. "There's no cause for alarm," said the figure in the suikan, slowly undulating his cypress wood fan. "The robbers have been dealt with." When the 5 Razotsu came running, he pointed with his fan to the 3 silhouettes lying at his feet. "Take them into custody." Chapter 7. It was to be a night of surprises. The first surprise was that the young man from the Imperial Prosecuting Office, using only his fan, had seemingly made the 3 robbers faint with fear. The fan was made entirely of thin strips of cypress, and since it was almost a foot and a half long, it could be used as a baton when folded. But the Razotsu were unaware of this, and even if they had known, it would still have stunned them to learn that he could defeat 3 sword-wielding robbers with it. The second surprise was that among the robbers there was a woman in her 30s, which they did not immediately realize on account of her wearing a mask and the man's kimono. Lifting up the 3 figures who had been knocked unconscious, the Razotsu either slung them over their shoulders or dragged them by their hands and feet to the jail in Kondemacho, where the third surprise awaited them. After arriving at the prison, they were all herded into a cell of their own. "Hey! What's all this?" they protested, panic-stricken. "No idea," replied the guard on the other side of the bars. "Chief Inspector's orders." Naturally, it had come as a quiet surprise to them to learn that the samurai in the Fuka Amigasa was also a chief inspector, and that he was a colleague of that devil in Heian garb. But In that case... Imokawa muttered, looking worried. Maybe the chief inspector has been following me all this time. Maybe they've been following all of us. The other four turned pale. Do you think that's why we've been thrown in here? Asked Saruki, cradling his head in his hands. But wasn't Ichinohata left off the hook after he was taken to task by that Western scholar this afternoon? Asked Yoko Makura. Besides, all Razotsu do this sort of thing. Why are we the only ones being locked up? Whatever the reason, the fact remained. They had been thrown behind bars, which did nothing to relieve their anxiety. So, might the two chief inspectors be around? Onimaru asked the guard. They might, the guard replied before adding, they appear to be doing something at the execution ground. The five Razotsu looked at one another. In the dead of the night? Asked Ichinohata, his voice hoarse. Oh, and just a little while ago, somebody arrived by palanquin. Apparently, the chief inspector summoned him. What? Their anxiety levels shot up. Who is it? I've no idea, but he was shown, still in his palanquin, straight to the execution ground. Ah, yes, about those three robbers you brought in earlier, said the guard, changing the subject. They were some pretty big fish, you know. One is Wild Dog Kinbei, another is Scarface Taji, and the third is Ball Breaker Aya. Never heard of them. You're all pretty new around here, so it's only to be expected, the guard said. He had served there as a guard since the old days. I don't know how many people they must have killed. They were the most feared gang we had here, but they were let out under the new regime. Don't ask me why. But hey, you did good catching them again. Hey, maybe they're going to be executed, Imokawa suggested. I doubt they'd do it at this time of night. So do I, added Ichinohata, who knew the place well. I've never heard of them carrying out an execution in the dead of the night. In fact, I may as well tell you, one of my jobs here is to deal with the bodies after the beheadings. The four others stared at Ichinohata in horror. Nobody dared joke whether he would be dealing with his own corpse that night. It was about half an hour later that several prison officials arrived and the Razotsu were conducted from their cells to the execution ground. Needless to say, this sent the five into a terrible panic. Terrified by the sound of jeering voices, they all began to tremble. Saruki, for one, failed to spot that one of his enormous shoes had slipped off, while the heroic-looking Onimaru seemed to suffer a fit of cerebral anemia and went crashing to the ground. In the end, the prison guards had to prop him up on both sides. After passing through several wooden doors, they saw that the night sky ahead of them was aglow. Something was burning down below. What's that fire? I have no idea, but that's the execution ground over there, answered Ichinohata, his teeth chattering. Eventually, they arrived in front of a small gate cut into a mud wall. A palanquin had been set down beside it, but the Razotsu didn't even have the time to realize that this must be the one the guard had told them about. You're ordered to go through, the guard said. Quickly now. The door opened, and through they went. Then the door closed behind them. Boom. Chapter 8. What awaited the already half-dead Rasotsu on the other side was a scene that could have been dreamt up only in the hereafter. The execution ground was enclosed by a mud wall that was cracked and crumbling all over, and right in the center of the square, 4 bonfires were burning. These were what was turning the night sky red. Staked in the ground beside them were canes of green bamboo with their leaves still on them, bound together by the kind of rope ordinarily reserved for Shinto ceremonies, with the zigzag paper streamers attached to the rope fluttering in the wind. In the middle of the square, a 3-tier scaffold had been erected, upon which stood 2 solid-looking pillars side by side, twice the height of any man, with just enough space between them for somebody to pass through. They were connected at the top by a thick board. But what was that thing attached to the board? The object was glittering a bright red in the light cast by the bonfires. Plainly, it was an iron blade, and it was slanting downwards. There was another board at the bottom of the 2 pillars, with a square basket fixed to the nearest side of it. There was also a rope dangling from the top of the structure. Though the spectators did not know what this device was intended for, the very sight of the grim spectre sent a shudder straight to the depths of their souls. On the far side of it stood 3 silhouettes. 2 of them belonged to Keishiro Kazuki and Toshiyoshi Kawaji. Kazuki was in his usual attire, but Kawaji had removed his hat. He must have been around 36 or 37, wore a sharp, upward-pointing mustache, and had a look of considerable resolve about him. Without even glancing at the Rasotsu, who had just entered, Kazuki turned and said, "Well, are we ready?" "Oui," the figure next to him replied with a nod. It was a woman's voice, and there was something odd about it. Who on earth was this? Once again the Rasotsu could scarcely believe their eyes. She was wearing something fluttery and pink, almost like a mosquito net. They didn't know the name for this either, but the woman had on a broad-brimmed Ichi Megasa hat, which had a long cylindrical veil trailing down from it. "Right, you men," said Kazuki, turning to the Rasotsu for the first time. "You see those 3 bandits over there? Bring the one with the scar on his face up to the scaffold first." The 5 men finally noticed the figures of the 2 men and 1 woman sitting directly beside the entrance. There was no doubt about it. These were the robbers from earlier. By now, of course, they had all regained their senses, but their hands had been tied behind their backs, and as they beheld the strange sight before them, they seemed to look on with eyes devoid of consciousness. "The rest of you, keep a close eye on the other 2. The penny finally dropped. The bandits were the ones for the chop. "Ah, yes, sir!" As though propelled by springs, Ichinohata and Yokomakura stepped forward. For Ichinohata, the reflex was almost automatic, since he had been assisting with the beheadings for some time already. Yet, for the lazy Yokomakura, his uncharacteristically enthusiastic response was more the result of a burst of elation and delight. "Get to your feet!" The one they were dragging off had a grisly scar, the vestige of a terrible burn, covering the right half of his face. It was Taji. They approached the scaffold from the one side on which there was no rope cordoning it off and climbed the steps leading to the platform. They followed the commands issued by Kazuki's voice and fan, But they were stunned when he gave the order to lay the prisoner face down on the bench. Ichinohata and Yokomakura knew that this man was to be beheaded, but the exact means of this eluded them. Just as they were wondering how on earth they were going to do it, they looked up and suddenly saw the enormous blade hanging overhead. Then a chill ran down their spines. Finally, they realized what this instrument was for. The board at the foot of the pillars is in two parts. Lifting the top one of them will make a hole. That's where you are to place the criminal's neck. Then using the leather straps, tie his body to the bench. Kazuki walked around the ropes as he spoke and then climbed up onto the scaffold himself. As though under his spell, the two of them did exactly as he said. When they lifted the upper board, they found that it had been hollowed out into the shape of a crescent moon, and together with the other board it made a neat, round hole. Taji, who had been strangely unperturbed until that point, was finally struck by a fear that this was no ordinary execution, and began to resist furiously. However, because his hands were tied behind his back, they had no trouble pinning him down and placing his neck against the bottom of the hollowed-out crescent moon. When the other board was lowered from above, only his head stuck out on one side, while the rear was just a writhing trunk of human flesh. Then the two Razotsu strapped him to the bench. Scarface Taji, you will know that in the past your conduct would have warranted the hell of a crucifixion. You are to be put to death, but in this enlightened age you will be beheaded in the French fashion. Kazuki boomed as he clutched the hanging rope. At least you will have the honor of being the first in Japan to be subject to an experiment of this kind. You may be grateful, moreover, to know that you are being given the most painless kind of death known to man. He pulled on the rope. Jum! There came a noise that defies description. The hiss of iron. Shh! Then a cry that mixed wonder with horror. The cry was not that of a condemned man, but rather a mingling of the gasps of the two Razotsu standing on the scaffold with those of the spectators, and the sound of the prisoner's neck being cut. Thump! The triangular axe had fallen along the grooves cut into the two pillars and, with the force of its own weight, severed the head that was poking out of the hole, which then tumbled down into the basket below. A tremendous amount of blood surged up, bright crimson, into one of the bonfires. After a few moments of terrible silence, Kazuki spoke. Gentlemen, bring down the body and take it over there, then fetch the next one. Wild Dog Kinbei. As though having finally awoken from his stupor, Kinbei started howling and raging. Though he was still tied up, he tried to escape. Saruki tackled him to the ground, but he managed to roll over and send Saruki flying. Had it not been for Onimaru's Herculean strength, who knows what might have happened. And if Onimaru was keen to use the situation to show off, the fact remained that both he and Saruki were desperate to present themselves in a good light before the fearsome chief inspectors. The corpse on the scaffold was taken down by Ichinohata and Yokomakura. The headless body continued to spew up blood, leaving a slippery streak of red across the scaffold. In his place, Wild Dog Kinbei was dragged up, and true to his name, even after his head had been placed in the hole, he continued to struggle and rage. And now for the second one, announced Kazuki, as the iron axe dropped. Shook! As if by magic, Kinbei fell silent. Now in Kaishu Katsu's memories, the statesman tells of 3 villains whom he supposedly admired. The first of them, he wrote, would commit a robbery in Edo and, not spending the stolen money straight away, would instead bury it and flee to Kamigata. Once there, he would commit another robbery, bury that money too, and, when the dust of his previous crime had settled, return to Edo to dig up the money and spend it. This man went on alternating like this, and nobody clocked that he was a robber for the longest time. And his name was Taji. The second villain had been arrested and interrogated by a police sergeant, where most men would give any excuse to wriggle out of the situation. This one gave a full confession, saying that it couldn't be helped, that his arrest was the will of heaven. Then, when he was to be put to death the very next day, he was suddenly released amid the chaos of the shogunate's downfall. However, while his fellow inmates were in a frenzy of excitement, he never even so much as blinked, and instead merely said, "Oh, I see. Well, I'll be off then." And with that, he waltzed out of the prison. This one was Kinbei. That incident happened just after the government forces took Edo Castle, when Katsu was, for a time, entrusted with public security in the capital. What did it matter, he later wrote. Even if we beheaded 50 or 60 prisoners, the world wasn't going to be short of murderers and thieves. So I let them all go. The woman's story ran as follows. There was also a female prisoner in her 30s, he wrote. I wanted to learn the nature of her crime, so I paid somebody to go and question her in person. She claimed never to have spoken about it to anyone and said that she would tell it only to me. Because of my alleged beauty, she said. I've been approached by many lascivious men. Lascivious, filled with or showing sexual desire, lewd, lustful, lascivious. I've been approached by many lascivious men, so whenever a rich-looking one would come along, I would open my heart to him, and when we would, redacted, I would twist his redacted, killing him in the process. Then I would just grab the money and play innocent. Even when the doctor would come to examine the body, since there was no wound, he would say it couldn't be helped. I must have killed no fewer than 5 men in this way. Truly, is this not the height of boldness? May it please the attentive reader to fill in the redacted words for themselves. So much for the third figure, or Aya. When Heikurō, Imokawa dragged the temptress up onto the scaffold, even she half fainted before the prospect of the iron axe. And when the blood spurted from her self-avowed, beautiful head as it fell into the basket, not one of the men, for all their love of woman, would regret her loss. Instead, they merely averted their vacant eyes. But no, truth be told, the 5 Razotsu did not witness this spectacle at all, for their eyes were elsewhere. That the third condemned prisoner was a woman might well have aroused an irresistible curiosity, yet the figure in the Ichi Megasa, who until that point had been standing at the back, now floated forward and looked up at the scaffold from beside one of the bonfires. This is what had drawn their attention. Peeping out from the veil, which opened at the front, was a pair of blue eyes. Her complexion was as white as snow, and billowing beneath the veil, they could see hair of what appeared to be spun gold. Was this figure, who looked like a Heian noblewoman, in fact a lady from another land? My word, said Kazuki as he examined the fallen blade. That's some fine craftsmanship, not even a scratch on it. He smiled at the woman. But since we have the opportunity, I think we ought to test it out a little more. He then turned to face the 5 Razotsu. Now then, your misdeeds have already been investigated thoroughly. As Razotsu charged with maintaining public order in the capital, this is inexcusable. As if that were not enough, you are guilty furthermore of gross professional misconduct. When a citizen informed you of a robbery, not only did you ignore him, but you even tried to run off. What kind of men are you? What kind of policemen are you? It is utterly unforgivable. The 5 men gulped as they stood there, petrified. This afternoon, I told you that you would be sentenced to death without fail if you committed another crime. And you have done just that. Once again, the triangular blade swished up, silhouetted in his suikan. In his suikan, the chief inspector from the Imperial Prosecuting Office took the rope and said in a clear voice, which echoed delectably, "You are to be put to the guillotine one by one. Now, which of you will be next?"